Hey, Sun Devils, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm here with your Week 13 class notes. And this week, we're focusing on an important concept called federalism. That is, different levels of government. Sometimes we just use the general word government to describe any kind of entity that's out there controlling pieces of society. But what we want to do this week is kind of break it down and show you how there's different levels of government and how we divide the powers of government between the federal, state, and local levels. Because how we do that greatly determines who's making the laws, who we answer to, if a crime is committed, who has jurisdiction. There's all kinds of things to pay attention to. I think the number one lesson that I had in federalism actually came in between my junior and senior year when I was in high school. I remember getting a job. I'd had lots of jobs in the past. I kind of grew up in Nebraska. I was born in Colorado. I kind of also lived in Utah when I was in high school. And so I worked on a lot of farms, cutting cane in Nebraska, detasseling corn, moving pipe, even milked cows and stuff like that on the farm. Um, and I, hauled hay and stuff like that. So I got paid a lot of times when I was growing up. But in between my junior and senior year, I actually got a job. My neighbor had a slaughterhouse where he'd kill pigs and cattle and sheep and stuff and process meat. We made bacon and all kinds of processed foods. But I get this paycheck from this guy, and I noticed that there was two different taxes being taken out of my paycheck. There was the federal government that was taking out taxes, federal taxes, and there was the state government that was also taking out taxes. And I think that was the first time it kind of hit me. I mean, duh, I knew what state I lived in, and I knew there was a governor of the state and stuff. But it was the first time in my brain, I guess, that I really separated that there's two separate governments, and both of them are taking my money, right? And or have different laws. And when you fill out your taxes, you'll see that there's different tax laws for the country, the United States, the federal government, and the state of California, if you will. And there's even different rules that apply just to Apple Valley. Things that you can do in Apple Valley that might not be okay in Victorville or Asperia or Adelanto, because there are also local laws. So I think those are really important things. Like, for instance, in the town of Apple Valley, we're designated as a town and not a city. So as we've incorporated as a town, we have this town ordinance or a town law where you can't build more than 2 houses per acre, which means at no place in Apple Valley does it get too congested. Apple Valley is very spread out. And no matter who you are, if you own a home, then you'll have at least a half acre or more, even if you're right smack dab in the middle of town. And so that's something really interesting. And that's what we're talking about with federalism. So, what is federalism? Well, we're spreading out the power of government. It's one of the ways that we make sure that one person or one group of people doesn't get too much control over us. We separate the powers of government. A federal system divides power between a central government and smaller local governments. Okay, there's lots of different federal systems. I'm going to show you a map in a minute. So you can see that some countries are federal or federated, and some of them are unitarian, meaning there's just one central government that runs everything, in the country. Okay, sharing power at different levels is intended to ensure that the central government is powerful enough to be effective, but not powerful enough to threaten states or citizens. So, one of the ways that we check the power of government in our country is that we give a lot of power to the states. Now, when our country was first started, we were kind of dealing with what we called the Articles of Confederation. That is, when our country first started back in like the American Revolutionary times, back in the 1700s, for the first 10 years, our government functioned under the Articles of Confederation, and each state really was its own separate entity, and it was united in the fact that we would come to each other's aid. But when our country first started, we weren't very united at all. We called ourselves the United States, but each state was printing its own money, was negotiating its own treaties with foreign countries, and really charging tariffs and taxes on each other. And it looked like our country was going to fall apart because each state was so independent. But we kind of got together, and I say we, our founding fathers got together, and we're talking back in 1787, 1788, and 1789, where we had a constitutional convention where we at first were going to fix the Articles of Confederation, but we ended up scrapping them and just replacing them with the Constitution, which does lay out 7 articles. And then over time, there was this balancing act between how much power the federal government has versus how much power the states had. And there was even some crises where some states didn't like policies set by the federal government, to the point where we had a civil war. If you know anything about the Civil War, yes, it was fought over slavery. But really, one of the other underlying causes was this whole states' rights, or the power of the states versus the power of the federal government. States' rights is one of the contributing factors in the whole Civil War, the biggest war in American history. And Lincoln's goal was to preserve the Union, and the southern states seceded and formed a confederacy, or a loose joining of states. And so this is a deeply ingrained part of American history, federalism. Federalism also allows individual states to deal with problems at the local level. Remember when we first fought the American Revolution, we didn't like the fact that the king lived 1,000 miles across the ocean or more, and yet he was dictating policies to the colonies. So if you just kind of think of the same thing, a lot of states don't want Washington, D.C. telling them what to do, because each state has its own personality. Each state has its own needs and regulations. Okay. And so each state really can make a lot of its own laws, as long as their actions are constitutional, as long as they don't supersede, they can't supersede the federal government. Okay. So for instance, in the state of California, we don't allow casinos in California, but they do in Nevada. So thousands of people every weekend go up the 15 to Las Vegas so that they can gamble, or maybe they just go to State Line where the first casinos are. Okay. And a lot of the surrounding states to Nevada don't allow gambling. So that's why people go to Nevada for the gambling. Now, if you say, well, Mr. Moore, I know there are casinos in California. Well, the only casinos that are within the borders of California are on Indian territory. That is like reservations. That's why in California, if there's any casinos, it's called Indian gaming. And that gets slightly complicated, but that's the topic we're talking about, federalism. Okay, I'm going to show you a map again when it comes to Indian territories. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but this really is the entire context of the notes and the discussion this week. So I'll show you a map of California where there are Indian reservations that are within the boundaries of the United States, and they, I guess, technically are within the boundaries of California, but California doesn't have jurisdiction or control over those Indian territories. Thus, those Indian territories can opt if they want to have casinos, and some of them do. So that's why sometimes people will go down the hill, as it were, from Apple Valley, and go to casinos kind of within California, but really on Indian territory, Native American territory. So I kind of already went over this little life lesson, but when you get your first job, and maybe you already do, you're a senior, that's when a lot of people get their jobs. First one where you're really getting a paycheck and a pay stub, and you have to fill out the tax forms. Then you start to realize that there's both a federal and state government, because both of them want your taxes. And when you're looking at your pay stub, the gross is the amount of money that you actually earned, but the net is what you get to keep. So after taxes. And sometimes you might be surprised how much money is taken out by the government to carry out the functions of government. And that's when people really start to care about government, is when they have to pay, right? That's when students really wake up and say, hey, wait a second, I want to keep my money. I'm working hard for my money. Some people are like, I'm okay paying high taxes because I really want the government to help other people out. But this is where people really start to care about politics, when it affects your pocketbook. Now, we've talked in this class a lot about the three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, in between Maryland and Virginia, we would find the legislative branch is called Congress. It has two parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We would also find the executive branch, the president, right, living in the White House, working out of the White House with his staff and his cabinet. And then, of course, we would find the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. Now, each one of those three branches has a different job. The legislative branch is to make the laws, the executive branch is to enforce the laws, and the judicial branch is to review the laws, right, to see if they're constitutional. What's interesting is that each state also has three branches. They're the same branches: legislative, executive, judicial, but we call them different names, okay? So federalism is the division, the dividing, and the sharing of power between the national or federal government and the state government. So the federal government in Washington, D.C. has those three branches that oversee the whole country. But in California, and the capital of California is Sacramento. On our last test, a lot of people missed that. Some people put San Francisco or Los Angeles, or San Diego. Sacramento is not the biggest city in California, but it is the seat of government. Okay, so in California, there are three branches of government that oversee the government of just California. The executive branch of California is the governor. Okay, so at the federal level, we call it the president, but at the state level, we call him a governor. That's the executive branch. And of course, I ask you to learn the current governor's name of California. In 2020, Gavin Newsom. Okay, you can go Google it up. If you're watching this and it's not 2020, you might have to Google who's the current governor of California. But in past notes, we've talked about that. Now, the legislative branch in California is called the State Assembly. So right now in 2020, we're electing a president of the United States. We're also electing congressmen, that's in Washington, D.C., that's from California, who are going to serve in Washington, D.C. But we're also voting for legislators in California. That is the people who are going to make laws that apply just to California. So again, there is three branches at the federal level in DC, but also through the same three branches, but different people and different names in California. For instance, the judicial branch of California is called the Supreme Court of California. So if you break a law in California, you might work your way through the court system if you broke a state law, and you might end up at the Supreme Court of California. If you broke a federal law, you might end up in a different court system. It depends on the crime, and it depends on the evidence and who got the evidence and who's taking over jurisdiction of the case. Okay? But none of the things that we do in California can supersede what Washington, D.C. says. There is national supremacy. That's the 6th article of the Constitution. Now, interestingly enough, each state divides itself into counties. Sometimes people screw up that word countries. And what countries are actual different political entities like Canada and Mexico. I mean counties. That is taking California and dividing it into smaller pieces. Which splits the administration of the state into smaller, more local levels. So the town of Apple Valley that we live in is in the county of San Bernardino. And you can see this big giant county right here. Okay, that's where we'd find ourselves. And it goes down the hill to San Bernardino, but mostly it's the high desert all the way to the state line of both Nevada and Arizona. So San Bernardino is the biggest geographic region of California. Okay. And here I just kind of show you the website, and they kind of moderate, like, see, even rules about what's happening with this corona pandemic. So if we want to reopen schools in San Bernardino County, then we have to follow the guidance and the rules set out by San Bernardino County. And each county, Orange County, Los Angeles County, El Dorado County, each county gets to, have some control over its own schools, over the town entities that are within it, and to establish some different rules even within the county. So again, this is a way to kind of break down the roles of government to a local level. And obviously, most towns and cities would have a mayor and a town council. That would be the people who are making rules just for Apple Valley or whatever town you live in. And of course, this is San Bernardino County on the map of California, and kind of a map showing some of the cities and national parks and things that fall within San Bernardino County. Okay, so again, federalism is both the division and the sharing of powers in a country. Okay, so only the federal government can declare war and maintain an army and regulate trade between the different states. And only the federal government can admit new states and run the post office, set standards for weight and measurement, right? Like how much is a pound? How much is a foot? Coin money, right? Make foreign policy, right? Make laws that are carried out through the entire country. But each state gets to maintain its own schools, establish local governments and counties, regulate business and tax laws within the state, make marriage laws, right? So some states have gay marriage and some don't. And some have strict divorce laws and some don't. All right. And some have certain age limits on marriage and some don't. They provide for public safety, like police and highway patrols, and they assume the powers that are not delegated to the federal government. There are some shared powers, like states can borrow money from the federal government, or they can get money from the federal government to run their schools if they meet the federal government standards. They establish their own courts and banking systems. Those kind of things are shared. And so that's what federalism is this balancing of power, this shared power between Washington, D.C., our federal government, and the local state governments. So which countries are federations? That is, they use federalism. In Canada, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, they have provinces like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. Then they got, some territories like Nunavut and Yukon. So they have provinces. So instead of states, they have provinces. But you kind of get the same idea. It's still a federation. British Columbia gets to make some of its own rules as opposed to, say, Ontario or Quebec. Okay, in Canada, but they have a prime minister and they have a parliament, etc. Now, Mexico is a great example of a federated system. Some people don't know this, but the official name of Mexico is Los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, right? The United Mexican States. They've got 31 states and they have a federal district, right? Mexico DF, the federal district of Mexico. Just like we have the District of Columbia. So a lot of countries have states, like Brazil has states. Germany has states. Russia is literally called the Russian Federation. It's a conglomeration. India has states. Australia has states. But there are some countries that are Unitarian, meaning there's just one central government. And even if they divide it up into provinces or political regions, still the central government controls everything. Okay, so this is a little map kind of showing you that there's different systems, Unitarian or federalism. Now, as promised before, I was kind of talking about not all of the land in the boundaries of California are actually under the jurisdiction of California. I know that's weird, but you kind of have to remember the history of the United States. All of the land that is now the United States was taken from Native American tribes. That's the only way to say it. Okay? Sometimes forcefully, sometimes in treaties that were unfair. Sometimes Native Americans died off, or were overrun by settlers. But the current United States, and here's a map kind of showing you where the tribes used to be in the territory, drawing the lines of the states today, there are still reservations that exist. I mean, giant ones in Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of, Colorado and Utah. Okay, huge chunks that are still under the jurisdiction of tribes. And they get to form a lot of their own laws, and they have tribal councils. Now, those laws cannot supersede the rules of the United States. So they're kind of under federal territorial claims. That's why having the FBI is so significant, because within certain states, local police can't go into Indian territory or tribal lands. But the FBI could, because the Federal Bureau of Investigation has jurisdiction over the entire United States, right? This map shows you kind of across the entire country. This kind of focuses in on California. And so sometimes within these pockets of tribal lands, some Indians have built casinos. And that's why there are some casinos kind of, sort of, in California, if that makes sense. Most of the roads in Apple Valley are named after Indian tribes, so most of us know a lot of the Native American tribal names because we live in Apple Valley. In fact, Apple Valley High School is on Navajo, right? One of the major Native American tribes in the Southwest, okay? So I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to show you what I mean when I say federalism. We're talking about the nation as a whole. The capital is Washington, D.C., right, in between Maryland and Virginia. And there's three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. But each state also has three branches. We call them by different names, but it's still a legislative, executive, and judicial. So in California, the legislative is the state assembly. The executive is the governor. And of course, there is a court system, a state court system with a Supreme Court in California. And I think that's really important. And both governments, local and state and even national, charge different taxes. Out of your paycheck, only the national and state governments will pull taxes. But the local level collects its taxes by property taxes and by sales taxes. So sales tax is different in different parts of California even. You're charged a different sales tax. And like some states don't even charge sales tax. So that's why you get some of the different speed limit laws, the different gambling laws, the different marriage laws, and even different tax rates depending on where you are in the United States. What level of government is the most important to me? To you? Sometimes we spend so much time focusing on a presidential election, but most of us are never going to meet the president. He's not going to affect my life that much, to be honest. What really is going to affect my life is if I want to build a shed in my backyard, and I've got to find out what kind of regulations they have in Apple Valley if I want to add on to my house. Or if I want to go buy a quad or a side-by-side and take my kids out on the weekend to ride in the desert, I've got to know local laws. So maybe the local laws and local taxes, property taxes, become more significant than even what's going on at the federal level. Just a thought right there. And there's a complicated sharing between individuals, private entities, local governments, the state government, and the federal government. And I think some of these charts do a good job of kind of showing you how federalism works in the real world. What are the major responsibilities of the various levels of government? And what are their revenue sources? How does the federal government get its money? By charging income tax, taxing corporations, charging tariffs on imported goods, right? And how does the state get its money, right? Sometimes through property taxes and sales taxes at the state level. And, of course, state income tax. You have to file those, by the way, each year. When you file your taxes, when you get an actual job where you have to fill out tax forms, right? And you have to claim certain exemptions. You get start, some of you have done this before and you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have just maybe worked for your neighbor and, just taking cash or whatever for a job, babysitting or yard work, or maybe even working construction with your dad or whatever, and he just pays you some money. But it starts to get kind of complicated how governments collect their money. And there's even some things we're voting on in this election in 2020 at the local level. Should we raise the local sales tax? It's going to drive up prices, but it's going to give the town of Apple Valley more money to operate and do what it needs to. Okay. Why are powers divided among the different levels of government? Again, when we first started out this lecture, we were talking about the need to not allow the federal government to become too strong, but also it has to be strong enough to be effective. Okay. And some states are very independent minded, like Texas. But there's a reason for Texas being really independent minded, because Texas was actually its own country for about 10 years. If you remember your U.S. history, tons of Americans were moving into Mexico for free land that the government of Mexico was offering. And pretty soon more white Anglo-Americans were living in northern Mexico than, the mestizo, traditional Mexicans were. And they were speaking English and not so much Spanish. And pretty soon, Texans revolted against the government of Mexico and gained their independence. Remember the Alamo? And so Texas actually wrote its own constitution and had its own president and was its own republic, its own country for about 10 years. But finally, couldn't stand up to Mexico by itself. And most of the people had kind of grown up in the United States, and so it opted to join as a state and to not be its own independent country, but to join the Union, which of course later it kind of broke away and joined the Confederacy. But anyways, that's U.S. history, right? California kind of tried the same thing, but that only lasted a couple of days. If you look at the flag of California, it says California Republic. And we were just I say we were an independent country for like a couple of days. It didn't work out. We weren't strong enough. We were all the way across the country, and there was no train track at the time. So when we opted to join the Union as a state, California really wasn't an independent country, not like Texas. Texas was the legit deal. Now, what I need you to do is to spend some time each day or each week at least to make sure that you know our country, because that's part of this class. And both the second quarter midterm and final will have a map portion of the test. So take time to learn your country and the states in your country. You need to know all 50 states by heart. Washington, Oregon, and California. Alaska and Hawaii are detached, right? You have to actually drive through Canada to get to Alaska. Go by boat or plane out to Hawaii. Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. Then we got South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. I need you to know those. I need you to know your country. Obviously, you can go online and take your time. I've even given students a place where they can take a practice test ahead of time. I do have some great review videos at the end of each of my notes in case you're not fully understanding what we're talking about. It's important that we spend the time to learn these concepts and to soak them in. Thank you for being with me. This is week 13, Federalism, the Different Levels of Government.